And with that, I'm going to hand over to you, Joycelyn, for an intro to yourself and your work.
Thanks so much, Sandra. It's really good to be here and to be with you all today. So yeah, I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Okay, so yes, today I'm going to be speaking about my work, I guess over the next sort of 10-ish minutes. So I'm Joycelyn, and I'm a first-year PhD student at Cambridge, and I'm on the Artificial Intelligence for Environmental Risk programme. And I'm an affiliated researcher on the ERC-funded Smart Forest project with my co-supervisor, Jennifer Gabrice. So my work is spanning sort of machine learning and sociology and forest ecology, and I'll dive in literally the next slide more into what that is. But yeah, essentially my PhD research is in collaboration with the British Trust for Ornithology, which is a conservation organisation in the UK, and has also been funded by Cambridge Conservation Initiative. And it will take an interdisciplinary approach combining machine learning, bioacoustics, forest ecology, Indigenous knowledge, and sociology to investigate the role of technology in forest conservation. And I'm also the founder of Climate in Colour, which is an online education platform and sort of community space as well for the climate curious. And the aim of that platform is specifically to make climate conversations more accessible and diverse. So yeah, my practice is split sort of half and half, and I'm going to just dive into my academic work first, and then I'll go back to Climate in Colour a bit later. So this is the title of my PhD research currently. PhD titles and focuses change quite a lot, so this might not be what it ends up being at the end, but for now, this is what I'm working with. So monitoring Ghanaian forests with bioacoustics, machine learning, and Indigenous knowledge. And to kind of give a bit more context, this project will involve deploying acoustic sensors in the forest canopy in Ghana, which is also my place of heritage. And these audio sensors will be used to collect data, focus on gaining insights specifically into forest health and biodiversity. And I want to just touch on the motivation for this research really quickly. Because in recent years, I don't know if any of you are familiar with remote sensing, but remote sensing and machine learning have emerged really as key tools in supporting the understanding and monitoring of forest ecosystems and to aid conservation efforts. And usually that remote sensing is sort of like satellite imagery, drone, aerial imagery, lots of sort of imagery, computer vision tasks. And whilst this has been happening, the vast majority of conservation research has been centred on Indigenous lands, especially in tropical forests. But this work has, whether it's traditional conservation or conservation aided by technology, it usually happens at a significant remove from Indigenous communities, local communities, or local stakeholders who are the traditional custodians of those areas of conservation importance. So although remote sensing and machine learning techniques have supported scalability within the field and allowed conservation to make huge leaps forward, these methods can also kind of widen the disconnect between conservation projects and Indigenous communities, weakening those important links and connections to essential local knowledge. And as we become ever more reliant and invested in omniscient power of technology, and at times sometimes blinded by scalability to our approaches, forests are becoming these sort of increasingly capitalistic and neocolonial sites. And Jennifer Gabrice speaks on this phenomenon in her paper Smart Forests. And in this paper, she sort of describes how environments are becoming increasingly sort of technologized sites of data production. And paraphrasing from that paper, she gives examples of lots of different technologies that are being applied to forest conservation. such as the prevalence of startup drone companies who are developing sort of digital techniques for mass planting of forests from the skies. And obviously these companies are working toward the objective of planting billions of trees a year. And I guess this is a kind of interesting analogy because they're using sort of this rapid and industrial scale reforestation technique to compensate for industrial scale deforestation. And I think something really important, sort of important motivator for my work is that digital technologies are often presented as a necessary, if unproblematic tool for meeting ambitious climate targets. But without really understanding how these technologies both sort of enable and constrain different ways of engaging with forests and the development of just sort of forest conservation practices, there is a risk of these technologies reproducing and perpetuating social political inequities and undemocratic governance, including things like land grabs, which is highly prevalent in the current conservation technology space in forest ecosystems. So to round that up, there is obviously an urgent need for conservation to make use of state-of-the-art data science. It has been able to accelerate the amount of forest and other ecosystems as well that we've been able to protect and get a deep understanding about their fluxes and how they are changing in the face of the climate emergency. But what my research is focused on is making sure that the benefits that are gained from technology do not come at the expense of local knowledge and participation that are incredibly important to that those projects as well. So this is where my research hopes to sort of disrupt the status quo with community members really framing the key points of inquiry, co-designing the sensor deployment and experiments, and facilitating the identification of culturally important species, and also providing a better idea and understanding of historical or current Indigenous forest management techniques. Action and application orient my research, and it aims to apply supervised and unsupervised machine learning techniques to bioacoustic data. And I'm really happy to answer questions about that in more detail in the next bit. And also investigate the intersection or lack thereof of biodiversity and forest health indicators between Indigenous knowledge and machine learning analysis. And thirdly, the kind of overall goal is to develop an ethical AI and forest conservation framework through this sort of collaborative research design approach. And this all sounds great and I'm really passionate about it, but without thorough reflection on how I conduct this research and the creation of a framework with which to move forward, I could end up subconsciously perpetuating the systems I wish to dismantle. And so I think it's really important, and I give this personal example to sort of frame maybe the conversations that we have in the next hour. But regardless of the ways that I, as a Black diasporic woman of colour, am oppressed, there is no doubt about the privileges that I am awarded as an academic studying in the global north. And these privileges are based directly on the histories of environmental and computer sciences, which, like most spaces, have roots in the oppression and dispossession of marginalized communities. So it's essential to first acknowledge this history that lies behind work that I'm doing. That is not enough. And a deep interrogation of my practice constantly throughout my practice is necessary in order to not just avoid, but also dismantle systems of oppression continuing in environmental research and technological innovation. And there's this really great quote that I'm paraphrasing that says, "We must turn a critical gaze upon our collaboration in an effort to be the change we want to see." And this is like a real driving force behind any of my development of code or application of machine learning to real world issues, is that whilst I am critiquing technology as part of my thesis, I also have to critique my own work and how I am sort of navigating the space as well. And so it's really important to be constantly reflecting on my practice and have examples of a few questions that I have to ask myself. And this is not an exhaustive list, but it's also, again, to give an example of the kinds of questions that I'm asking. So how do I make sure that the engagement with Indigenous community is not extractive, regardless of whether I have heritage in that place or not? How do I create space outside of what I already know in order to mold my research methods in ways that honor the culture of the community I work with? How do I ensure that ethics and justice are ongoing conversations within my work and not just a sort of ethics form filled out or risk assessment filled out? What extended legacy plan is built into the study in order to avoid helicopter science, where researchers just drop into a community, extract data from them and leave never to be seen again? And how do I navigate critiquing and dismantling problematic aspects of Western science and technological development while simultaneously employing other techniques from the same space? And really importantly, how do I create space to center other voices where mine may not be appropriate? And obviously there are many more questions that I will have to ask myself, but I share these. Yeah, it's just an example of sort of the depth of questioning that is necessary in order to ensure that our practices are really in solidarity with marginalized communities. So quickly jumping to the other half of what I do, which is climate and color. And it's really important for me that, well, as a creative person, I'm kind of split in half. I really love science and math, but I also really love technology and communication and writing. And I think it's really important when we're thinking about technology to really think from a design perspective, as I'm sure most of you do already. And a lot of my work in that space, in the sort of public engagement space, design space, is really focused on making climate conversations more accessible and diverse. And I started Climate in Colour when I was accepted onto my program, because I knew that I was going to have access to a huge amount of information that, you know, without going to a certain university or being an academic at all, I would not have the access. And I think it was really important to me to be able to share that information that is incredibly important to others as well. So my work through Climate in Colour seeks to dismantle sort of oppressive and paternalistic rhetoric, exclusion and silencing and inaccessibility within climate communications. And I try to do this through varied media, from audio, video, graphic, design, writing, yeah, in order to sort of unlock information that's been historically reserved for academic spaces and hidden behind paywalls and institutional doors, to be accessed by the general public, who have a right to know and understand the phenomena that impact our society's present and futures. And akin to my research, the goal here is to centre the voices of the vulnerable, marginalised and oppressed communities at the forefront of the climate emergency, but also to allow for really accessible communication of climate science and how technology can be applied to the climate crisis. So I'm going to stop here and come back to this at the end, when I want to leave you with some sort of, I guess, practical ways to think about all of the things I've just said. So yeah, hopefully that's okay. Thank you for listening.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll get to those in a little bit. Before we get to those, I'm gonna kick us off with a few questions that that we kind of wanted to, as part of the recording here as well. So one of them is for you, Joycelyn. How do you think technologists, like all of us here, should be thinking about climate justice in their own work?
I think that it's even more simple than that, because our work is part of our wider lives, and pretty much all of our lives intersect with climate justice in one way or the other. The energy that we use, the products that we're using every day, I mean, the list is endless, that we can't get away from the fact that pretty much everything we interact with and everything that we do has an impact on someone somewhere else. And so it's not just about thinking about, say, any applications you're building specifically, because I think that there's a tendency to like get bogged down in sort of like, oh, well, my work has nothing to do with people, or my work doesn't fit into climate justice, it's not applicable. And it's actually to think about your work holistically, then what kind of servers are you using, what data centers are you using, how do you access the energy to even power what it is that you're working on. There doesn't have to be that direct link of, you know, mine is very obviously a project that works directly with communities, and there's a huge climate justice angle there, but it doesn't have to be like that in order for there to be really big implications for what our work does. And I think that that's one of the biggest issues within tech, is that so many of us assume that our work has nothing to do with justice and see our work in a sort of silo. But there are no sort of single issue struggles, and everything is interconnected. So I think it's really about expanding the way that you think about your work and interrogating all of the components of your work, not just the sort of surface level, this has got nothing to do with climate justice. And thinking about what is within your control to change, and what is it within maybe your company's or a wider organization's control, in terms of, like one example is that the Climate in Colour website, I could have just gone on and used Wix, but Wix isn't powered by, or at the time wasn't powered by renewable energy. I didn't know where the servers were, where my data would be held. And so I built the site from scratch with a developer, and we have a very patchworked backend that makes sure that every part of the backend is as sustainable as it could be. And this might not seem like a climate justice issue, but obviously the way that we consume data, especially in the global north, being the biggest consumers of energy, it is really important to think about. Yeah, hopefully that's helpful. I think it's just about expanding like where we see like the impact of our work, and usually it goes a lot further than we might think.
Yeah, I think one thing that you mentioned there as well, like it's the impact of the work, but it's also like the I guess going back to the resources required, which has to do with the impact, I guess, as well. But yeah, nice. We have a few more questions that we have here prepped, but we also have a few that were asked in the chat. So I'm going to ask one more that we record, and then we'll go off the record. So so a few of the people here work in like startups, for example, or in climate jobs already. So if people are in a climate job, or if they are founding a startup, do you have a different bit of advice for people to think about climate justice there, or is it pretty similar to what you just said about tech workers in general?
I think one of the like most cliche things to say about startups and people starting things is that obviously, unlike bigger organizations, there's a lot more flexibility and a lot more control about how your processes start, what the scaffolding of that business is. So in some scenario, in some sense, actually, if you're starting a startup, there's much more of a responsibility and much less of an excuse to not set things up in a way that is just, because those options are really open to us. And I think it also sets an example, I guess, if you're going for like VC funding, that if you're starting with that scaffolding, it really is going to send a message that can have a ripple effect, because obviously startups are seen to be sort of trendsetters and kind of the new standard. So I would say that, yeah, if you're starting a startup, there is a lot more responsibility because there is less of an excuse. That doesn't excuse bigger companies. I think most of the blame is on bigger companies. It's just that by the nature of startups, you have control about how you hire. Are you hiring remotely, which means that people don't have to commute? Are you hiring across the board in different countries, not just in global north countries, but with technologists around the world who might come from marginalized communities, who can give input into what it is that you're building, especially if it's a climate startup? Is it just being built by a certain type of people, or is there a really broad hiring strategy? How is I guess if we're talking about tech, like the app or the product or the service going to be hosted? I guess similar to what I was saying before, these really infrastructural questions are I guess you have more of the freedom to ask them and to make that better decision at the start. But I think also really making sure that those principles have been laid out from the beginning, because there is the space to do that, and to make sure that the company or the organization is built up from a place of sort of care and compassion, and one that is reflective of sort of what has gone wrong in other organizations. So really being tapped into, you know, environmental data justice writings in general, and listening, giving space to listen to technologists of color, technologists from marginalized communities, to ensure that we don't perpetuate this sort of paternalistic, we're a startup, we've got all the answers, we're going to go over here and save these people, or we've got this solution that's going to be implemented all around the world, without really an understanding of that locality or sort of differences in different places. I think it's a really great opportunity to put into question a lot of things that larger companies are finding it very hard to adjust to.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of the fact that I think helicopter science is one of the words or phrases that I learned from you. And I guess the same thing can happen with startups, where they come in, try and fix something for a community that they didn't really interact with before and aren't going to interact with after, and then they leave again.
I think a really interesting paper for people to read, and if you don't have access, I can just send it, is called Post-Colonial Computing. And it really does make these points really obvious. And you read the paper and it seems kind of embarrassing that technology would have had an impact in these certain ways. But one example is that there was a startup that was trying to create a solution to water insecurity in India. And they didn't have the funds, or they didn't want to take the time to raise the funds in order to go to India. And so they did their market research on Indian Americans, which, you know, who aren't living in the locality for the products that they are building, and is a gross generalization and really actually quite discriminatory. But for some reason in their minds, that seemed like a good idea because of whatever funding they already had, and feeling like their idea was great and it could just be applied somewhere else. And I think that reading through that paper, that it has really great case studies of these really awful mistakes that are made, that when you read them, it's like, well, why would you ever think of doing that? But that is sort of how, you know, in tech we get quite caught up with our ideas and caught up with the excitement behind them, but how much time and space is actually really given to diving into the hard questions, which one of the hardest questions in tech is, should this even exist? Does this need to exist? So yeah.
Yeah, amazing. On that note, Melissa, if you could stop the recording and we'll go into the audience questions. Nice. We will now jump into some of the stuff that we did as a group in the past, and we will kind of show some of that and then ask for Joycelyn's reaction to all of that. Richard.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joycelyn. Great. I'm so excited to have you here. So moving to the second part of our event. So what we did last time is we discussed ways that climate justice can be embedded into tech in different fashions. And at our event earlier, we applied this power analysis framework from environmental justice scholarship to some examples of technology intersecting with climate change. And so for those who weren't able to attend the event, the power analysis framework comes from scholarship of Sonia Klinsky and Anna Maravajani, who adopted it from work of David Schlossberg. And so we propose that this framework can be used to dig into the power dynamics and justice or injustice within different projects or different organizations. And so that framework consists of 3 areas. So the first area to look at is distributive justice, who is harmed and who is helped. The second area is procedural justice, who has the power in decision making and who is left out, maybe who is in the room, who's not in the room. And then the third kind of lens or set of questions to ask are recognition justice, whose needs are seen or ignored in decision making. And there's sort of a seeing people, as fully human in this. There's also a sort of metrics component of this, at least in the way we discussed it. And so we applied all this thinking to a number of different examples and did some brainstorming around them. But we thought we'd bring up one to discuss with Joycelyn, which is about carbon offsets. And I'm going to kind of paraphrase it here. But you work for a medium-sized UK-based startup tasked by management with getting the right carbon offsets for your business. You're committed to being 100% carbon neutral, or even carbon negative through offsets. You're looking at offset programs, including 1, forest protection in the Amazon, 2, high efficiency cook stoves for women in Peru, and 3, wind farm development in India. What justice issues could arise? How could you address them? So we had participants sort of analyze the scenario through asking those questions, through those lenses, and we had a bunch of different reactions, which you can see in the Miro board. Maybe we can share that. So yeah, Joycelyn, we would just love to hear your impressions on this framework, as well as the scenario that we discussed, and would just love to have any insights or reactions that you have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. I think that yeah, this whole board and the framework are really, really cool, and I think more people should know about it, because it is a really good chance to get lots of ideas on paper. And I guess for me, carbon offsets is a very tricky subject, and I think it's something that's been really picked up on within the tech space. And unfortunately, I guess I don't have personally good, or I don't personally support carbon offsets in their current form. And I'll go into a little bit why. I think one of the main issues with carbon offsets and the language around carbon offsets, say carbon neutral or carbon negative, implies that a company will not be responsible for emissions, or that a company is having a positive impact on the environment, which is just not true. You can't put up a ton of carbon today and take it out 100 years down the line. You can't guarantee that. So, you know, whether they're forest projects, those forests can burn down in forest fires, they can be illegally logged, they can just die of diseases, and the rhetoric around a company having avoided emissions is just, it's inaccurate. The kind of opinion that I have on carbon offsets is that it's actually such an important way to raise climate justice funds. And I think that money should be put forward through carbon offsets under a different name to support positive projects, because essentially that is what it's doing. It is charitable donations to projects around the world to support local communities in protecting the land that they already have. And it's a great way to allow the community to build on land justice and to achieve land justice. But that's it. And I think the language around carbon offsets as having this sort of like taking away carbon is just, it's just not true. So I think that first and foremost, any company thinking about carbon offsetting, it should be really clear that this is something positive that we are doing. It's, you know, we are investing lots of money into positive change, into conservation, into protection, into clean energy. Like everything about carbon offsets, apart from how it's described, I think is completely positive. But I think that the risk there is a company feels that they are they don't have a responsibility for the current emissions that they are putting up into the atmosphere that will continue to warm the planet because they have achieved these carbon offsets. So that's just my initial roundup of my opinion on carbon offsetting. Would it be possible to get the board up again? Because I think that there was sort of another. So yeah, my whole master's thesis was on the RED project, which is reducing emissions for deforestation and degradation. It's a UN forest protection project which is based on carbon credits. That's the whole point of it. It was implemented after the 2015 climate conference. And I think it's really important here to think about who is harmed and who is helped with carbon offsets. And in general, who is helped are large companies who want to continue avoiding the fact that they are polluting, or they want to just continue their polluting activities without having that responsibility. And the specific case study I was working in was in a RED project in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there was a lack of conversation with communities. There was a lack of justice in terms of how communities were consulted. And there was a lack of inquiry into how communities use their environment and what would actually be of value in those specific projects. So in this region, there were sort of a few different villages together, and no sort of inter-village relationships were sort of explored to understand how they interacted and how they used the land. Neither was the fact that women used the savannas for subsistence crop growing. And in this specific project, both the savanna and the forest were banned from use from the village. So this had a bit of a backup effect where women weren't able to grow their subsistence crops to eat. So they would log some parts of the forest in order to have land to grow the food to eat. And additionally, the payments that were supposed to be given to the community, 3 years went by, no payments, and that caused a huge amount of food security for the community. And they ended up protesting by burning the savannah just to get the attention of WWF, who was running that project, and the wider RED program, because they were absolutely fed up of not being able to grow their own food because they had to protect these environments, but also not receiving the money in order to buy food to protect the environments. So I think it's super important when, I guess, part of that question was how to make sure that you're investing in the right projects, is diving into reports and speaking to people on the ground, whether that's through organizations like Rainforest UK, do a lot of on the ground work with forest schemes like this. The other one is Forest People's Partnership. They also do a lot of work in this, and really engaging with grassroots organizations on the ground who can vet projects, because it's all well and good. I know there are lots of tech companies popping up now who can sort of say that they can validate these projects, but without actually hearing, and this is where the intersectionality and climate justice comes in, without actually hearing from the people in situ. It's not really a just process to just accept that someone else, who is usually in the global north, has said that it is valid. And yeah, I guess that kind of feeds into the procedural justice. Who has the power in decision making? Who decides whether a carbon offsetting project is good or not? Is a carbon offsetting project good just because there's a number of trees there, or are we going to look more broadly at sustainability? How does it continue to positively impact food security, livelihood, job security, all of these other aspects to the climate crisis that are all interlinked, and you can't think about one without the other. So who is at the table when these decisions are being made? Who is able to say whether a project is positive or negative? Because this is another thing within the carbon offsetting space, is that the reports from the carbon offsetting companies detail the project as being incredibly positive, and the complaints from the community are the complete opposite. And so it's like, well, which one is right? And I guess that's the same again with the recognition justice. Do we just go off the positive recommendations from the project and ignore the complaints from the community, whose ideas, whose opinions are actually seen to be important in that decision making, and who is sort of silenced? So hopefully that breaks that down. I don't mean to be negative at all. It's just that I think it's really, really important when people are, like their lives are really at stake, they're being dispossessed from their ancestral lands, and that it is of no help to anyone for us to, I guess, hide away from the realities of these issues now to later find out that they've caused more harm than good.
what do you think is the barrier to keep those people being listened to? Like, because I guess I'm presuming, at least on some level, the people who are executing these carbon offset projects are well-intentioned, you know, and there may be do you think, so what is interfering with that? Do you think it's a profit motive? Do you think it's a sense of urgency? Do you think it's, you know, just sort of racism or some other type of like structural or conceptual way of looking at things that's causing a problem? Like, I mean, obviously it's hard to speculate, but I just wonder what your sense is.
I think it's just good intention is not good enough. I mean, missionaries went across with good intention. You can go with good intention to have bad impact. I think there's a few reasons. Definitely there is this sort of urgency or steadfastness in an idea and the pressure for these ideas to work, such as carbon offsetting, that it's really, there's a discomfort in anything getting in the way of that. And I think that's pretty much like analogous to the way that tech works in general. Like, we want it hard, fast, quick solutions, scalable, huge, deploy it everywhere, it's going to be great. Because that's sort of the environment, right? And also we have this time period that's been set by our governments that we need to reach X amount of emissions. And so there is that sort of, part of it is ego, part of it is capitalism, of being, you know, the one or the big company to create that change, or to be in charge of that, or be responsible for that impact and that change. So as I was describing before, those drone companies that are reforesting from the sky so that they can meet this billion tree target, you know, how much thought has been gone into what trees and where, and all of these other considerations that need to be made. So I think it's just the nature of technology and technological development is to try and get things out really fast. And you know, when you have design sprints, it's, you know, to get things out quick, fast, learn, throw stuff on the wall and see what sticks. And that becomes less useful when you're dealing with people and people's lives. Obviously, capitalism is a huge one. Companies, if they don't have to, will rather continue their emitting behaviors and still get props for being positive on the planet. And there's huge money in carbon offsets, not for the communities, but there is huge money for carbon offsetting companies. So I think it's a mixture of urgency, of pressure to reach certain goals, and an over-reliance of the sort of connotations of green, nature-based, these lovely organic words that make consumers and businesses feel good about what it is that they're doing, without really considering what those actions actually signify.
Okay, thank you. That's fantastic. Yeah, just really appreciate all your thoughts.
Thank you very much for all of those amazing answers. I think for me, my main takeaways, I guess, were like this acknowledgement of, in tech, we don't have all the answers, and then this sense of slowing down and that time being spent on allowing for deep reflection and deep listening as core pillars to get to a better system where we all kind of work better. And if you do have any reflections yourself as well, feel free to share them in either of the SAC communities, either Work on Climate or Climate Action Tech. If you do want to dive deeper into the topic of climate and colonialism, or just food security and food systems, the Climate in Color website has a few courses where Joycelyn has put together wonderful resources where you can dive deeper into those topics as well. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.